What do you hear when I say this? If I keep talking and you're a normal person and you understand English, you hear a question. And there's a lot of different parts that go into you hearing that as a question. There's the WH word substituting for the content I'm asking you about, and it's shifted to the beginning of the sentence. There's also a recognizable question intonation pattern, which relates to relative pitch contrasts on stressed syllables in words that are particularly important for conveying my meaning. But humor me now. What do you hear when I say, what do you hear when I say this 10 times? Trust me, there's a point to this. What do you hear when I say this? 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 If you're like me, and most of you are, you hear melody. I actually went back after recording and transcribed it, and it's this. What do you hear when I say this? There's something really, really interesting going on here in our brains, and that's what I'm talking about today, with a little help from this week's sponsor, LingoPie, for some extra examples. I'll tell you about them in a minute. So today we're talking about the secret, hidden patterns of music in language, and we'll go over everything from academic silos to 20th century classical music to Sweet Brown of Ain't Nobody Got Time for That fame.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
And along the way, we'll talk about how stress and intonation differ across languages, how stress and intonation affect how you're perceived in a second language, and the easy way to learn stress and intonation better, along with the hard way if you're a nerd. But then again, I know who my target audience is. If you're new to the channel, I'm Dr. Taylor Jones. I've got a PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania, and on the channel, I discuss everything related to language, linguistics, language learning, and culture. If you're into those topics, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. This is Language Jones. I want to give a big thank you to LingoPie for sponsoring today's video. Using LingoPie to study a few languages actually got me back into intonation, and I'll explain why intonation is so important in just a moment. But real quick, LingoPie is a streaming platform that actually helps you learn languages through TV and movies. Here's what it does. You watch real shows and films in your target language, but with interactive subtitles. You can click any word or phrase, see the translation instantly, and it automatically adds it to your flashcards. You can also unadd it, which is nice if, like me, you sometimes click the wrong thing. Since you're not just memorizing isolated vocabulary lists, you're seeing language in context, hearing how pragmatics, intonation, and culture all fit together, it's a really great resource. But that intonation part is where I get really, really excited, and it was part of the impetus for this video. Intonation is notoriously difficult to learn well in another language, and for good reason. It's not even all that well understood by linguists. Kind of a theme on my channel. And it's not something that you're going to learn from a textbook or, God forbid, an AI-first learning platform. And where LingoPie really shines is that not only is it real speakers using language in context, but you can slow the language down and even loop chunks of language synced by captions. I'll have more to say about LingoPie a little bit later, and I'll use them for examples in a few languages, since they have all of these languages. But for now, I want to get back to the linguistics, so I'll just say that if you want to get started with LingoPie, click my link in the description for 55% off the annual plan. So, what's going on with intonation and music? Well, there's the linguistics, which varies across languages, and there's the music of it all. I'll do a full deep dive on intonation soon because it's really, really interesting, and it was more or less gate-kept in grad school. But for today, all we need to know about the language part of it is that different languages do different things differently, kind of another theme on my channel, with regards to stress and intonation. Regarding stress, that's something that, surprise, surprise, isn't neatly defined. But it's a constellation of factors that include loudness or perceived loudness, syllable length, and in a language like English, whether a vowel is reduced to a schwa, that's the sound in words like incorporation or antepenultimate. It's the nt in mutant and the ja in ninja. There's also the fact that the stressed syllable seems to be where intonational melodic things occur. But not all languages reduce unstressed syllables. Take French. No reduction. There's deletion, which I made a whole video about, but no schwas floating around going everywhere. But even more different, French puts stress on the last full syllable of a phrase in a group. That is, you'll have stress on the final syllable of a single word like metaphors, but a phrase, in linguistics a chunk of words that all go together in a meaningful way, but not necessarily a whole sentence, like with your metaphors, avec des métaphores, will still have only one stress. And yeah, that's like English, where the little function words don't really get stress. But the difference is when you have something like, you really have to stop with your metaphors. In English, we might stress really, like I did for emphasis. We have to stress the word stop, just because it's an important content word, and then we stress metaphors. But in French, that whole thing gets one primary stress. And you can hear it if you listen a few times.
Manu, faut vraiment que t'arrêtes avec tes métaphores. Manu, faut vraiment que t'arrêtes avec tes métaphores. Manu, faut vraiment que t'arrêtes avec tes métaphores.
Just to note, there's two phrases here. The first is addressing the listener as Manu. So, completely unlike English, French won't differentiate between two words based on stress, like project and project. In addition to that, English is what's called stress-timed, and French is syllable-timed. The idea is that in languages like French and Spanish, syllables all get about the same amount of time, so there's a sort of regular rhythm to the language. Not so in English, which I'll illustrate with the sentence that nearly got me kicked out of preschool. We should have known I was going to be a linguist. It's story time. My dad got a call from the teachers at preschool because I was stomping around on the playground, kicking dirt and repeating the same phrase over and over again. We're late enough in this video, it shouldn't affect monetization for strong language, so I just really liked the rhythm of the sentence. It was, fucking son of a bitch, fucking son of a bitch, ba-ba-da-ba-da-da. What it wasn't was ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba. If you're wondering how that turned out, they asked if he had any idea where I might have heard such language, and he said, as the story goes, how the fuck should I know? Love you, Dad. So, languages do stress and rhythm differently. That wasn't ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba. It has ba-ba-da-ba-da-da. But on top of that, languages have characteristic intonational patterns that are sort of the music of the language. That's how people talk about it. They talk about it as music. But is it really the right way to think about it according to the science? I was always biased because I was a musician before I was a linguist, so I just assumed that it was. But that's not really how they do talk about it. And here's the thing, it turns out that that's important, your background, how you were trained when you went into linguistics. There's currently a huge disagreement in how linguists talk about the intonation of English between British and American schools, where the British have a long tradition of thinking of things in terms of sort of patterns of movement. They'll tell you that there are 5 main intonational patterns, where the most important word in a sentence, in some sense, work with me here, is the site of a pitch contour. A fall in declarative sentences, a rise in questions, and there's 3 others I'll discuss in another video. But the Americans are all largely all in on a system called Toby, which sounds like another streaming video on demand platform, but is actually short for tones and break indices. That's the plural of index. And the idea there is that the melody doesn't really matter. How you get from A to B doesn't matter. What matters is that there's a target tone that's relatively high or low compared to what's around it. And of course, you have some number of them, so a high tone that's on the main part of an important syllable can be next to a low tone, let's say at the end of a phrase, and you've got your falling declarative pitch pattern. Now, trust me, I know that that's boring. Where this gets interesting is how it changes across languages and how it relates to music and musicality. So the sing-songiness of, say, Persian is something that we perceive precisely because we don't use pitch contours in the same way in English, and because speakers have their own individual voice range, which means a high target tone and low tone might consistently generate the same approximate notes, but not across speakers. So English has a handful of what linguists might think of as basic intonational relationships, where what matters is just the difference. Is it low, 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 high? Is it high, 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 low? And there's like 5 of those, and then you can do some extra things with mixing and matching or using them with different speech acts, and that's a whole different video for a whole different day that I'm working on. But that's like, there's a handful of basic melodies for English that get stretched to the length of the phrase, clause, or sentence, and that might get some extra sprinkles on top for focus or whatever. So that's how you can tell somebody's watching the BBC, for instance, in another room, even when you can't hear the words. You're hearing the BBC rhythm and melody. This is the BBC World Service. But I said melody. Is it really melody? Weirdly, linguists doing psycholinguistics only seem to have really gotten into this in the 2010s. I was reading a collection of papers from 2012 or so that largely excitedly reported that there is some evidence for the music parts of the brain lighting up for speech. But at that point, auto-tune the news was already a thing. While the academics are doing serious research trying to figure out if speech lights up the music centers of the brain, people were just out here singing, "Ain't nobody got time for that."
Ain't nobody got time for that.
Or, "Hide your kids, hide your wife."
Hide your kids, hide your wife.
And almost 30 years before that, Dr. Diana Deutsch had written about auditory illusions where speech turns into music.
Sometimes behave so strangely, sometimes behave so strangely, sometimes behave so strangely, sometimes behave so strangely, sometimes behave so strangely.
The real illusion is intense because once you've musicified a chunk of speech, it actually sounds like the speaker bursts into song if you play it in a broader context. Check this out.
Sometimes behave so strangely. Sometimes behave so strangely.
Sometimes behave so strangely.
Sometimes behave so strangely.
Sometimes behave so strangely.
Sometimes behave so strangely.
I seem to recall jazz musicians playing along with memes like Sweet Brown's Ain't Nobody Got Time for That, but I couldn't find them when prepping for this video. I don't think I imagined them. I did, however, find this jazz musician mocking somebody in a club saying, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa." Maybe my editor will surprise me, who knows.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
And as I was doing research for this video, I saw that Nare Sol had made a video about a similar topic, but from the classical music world. I knew that Steve Reich had experimented with recorded speech as early as the 1960s with things like, "It's gonna rain."
It's gonna rain, it's gonna rain, it's gonna rain, it's gonna rain.
What I didn't know was that Czech composer Leoš Janáček had meticulously transcribed all sorts of phrases he heard around him and used that for the basis for music.
Však už je čas.
There's a great video on this from the classical musician perspective from Nare Sol on YouTube. So, a full century after, there are string quartets and operas and symphonies written based on the melody and rhythm of spontaneous speech. Linguists, presumably not the ones big on music, are asking, do the music centers of the brain light up when we hear speech? Now, it is somewhat gradient. The answer is obviously yes, but it's also more yes when you hear it on repeat. And here's where I get to the practical takeaway. If you're learning a language and you don't bother with learning the intonational patterns and melody of that language, you are going to suck at your language. You can have perfect grammar. You can have a tremendous vocabulary. But if your prosody is wrong, you'll be perceived as having more of a foreign accent, because you do, and as being less intelligible. And foreign accents are known to be related to perceptions of confidence and intelligence. So now you're probably seeing why I get so hype about using something like LingoPie. Yes, I can learn vocabulary and all that jazz, and that's great, but I can slow down the audio and I can loop it. So I know the rhythm and melody of the types of sentences in French or Italian or Hebrew or whatever I'm learning. And those are really different. But also, I think you might be able to say which is which just from the notes. I did a quick Language Jones linguistic shenanigan. That's trademarked. It's not. Which I would put a lot more care and effort into if this wasn't just for a video. I took declarative sentences in French, Italian, and Hebrew, all from shows that I watched on LingoPie, and I extracted the audio, cleaned it, imported it to Logic, pitch corrected, extracted a MIDI melody, and then took the MIDI and generated sheet music in MuseScore. Now, did I make sure I got the tempo correct or anything like that? Absolutely not. No. So don't at me about transcription. The transcriptions are not ideal. But let me play you some sentences and you tell me which is which language. For a bonus, you've already heard the French sentence on repeat. So here we go. Did you know which was which? How confident are you? Leave me a comment. Here's the source material.
faut vraiment que t'arrêtes avec tes métaphores.
Firenze è un comune italiano.
בול בזמן לעזור לי לערוך את השולחן.
And here's each back to back.
Faut vraiment que t'arrêtes avec tes métaphores.
Firenze è un comune italiano.
בול בזמן לעזור לי לערוך את השולחן.
But let's say you're learning Italian. Instead of compiling a database of thousands of sentences that you've processed musically, like Leoš Janáček, you could just get an intuitive feel for this kind of thing by listening to a lot of your target language spoken in communicative situations. And even better, you could loop the audio until you hear the melody of it. And it's actually very clear. So take that sentence about Florence. Well, listen to the preceding few sentences.
Gondola simbolo di Venezia, simbolo che si trova nel ferro da prua, quella specie di pettine che ha la funzione di bilanciare il peso del gondoliere. Firenze è un comune italiano.
They all have a similar melodic contour because they're all the same type of sentence doing the same type of thing in Italian. And if you want to get good at generating it, well, you could theoretically record your voice and then compare to the audio you're parroting. And what do you know? LingoPie has that built in too. That's why I have to thank them for sponsoring this video. I was literally just using them as a source of intonational material for both language study and, well, linguistics when they offered to sponsor a video. So of course, you could also play life on hard mode like linguists do and try to figure all of this out by poring over pitch tracks extracted from spectrograms and prod or whatever, but why would you do that? At this point, I prefer to look at pitch tracks in Audacity, but you don't need to do any of that. So it really is true. It ain't what you say, it's the way that you say it. It ain't what you watch, it's the way that you hear it. It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it.
Ain't what you do, it's the way how you do it.
And that brings me to the last weird connection here. Jazz music. One of the best compliments I ever got in my life was somebody who told me, "You sound black." And they were talking about my phrasing on the guitar, which I always attributed to a combination of growing up in black speech communities and listening to Grant Green. Because the call and response and the rhythmic figures of jazz have their origin in, yes, the melting pot of the United States, but primarily in black English. Although your Gershwins and Berlins and Goodmans and Shaws and definitely Conances could hang too. And I think there's a strong linguistic component there. Tell me this don't sound hip. A good friend of mine teaches jazz to musicians in East Asia, and part of their homework from him is listening to the musicians that they want to sound like. Listening to them speak, that is. All right, it's that time again. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, you can support it on YouTube with super thanks or over on Patreon at patreon.com/languagejones. If you want to try LingoPie, click my link in the description. Please, by the way, leave me a comment. They are great for the algorithm. And subscribe if you haven't already. You made it this far. You clearly like what I'm doing. Until next time, happy learning.